The theater of punishment. On an August morning in 1570, the Kremlin's inner chambers closed like a jaw, sealing nobles inside a silence thick with fear, because this was not a court convened for justice, but a stage prepared for warning, and at its center stood Ivan IV, Tsar of all Russia, a ruler who had learned that death alone was too quick to teach obedience. So when a rival prince was dragged before him on charges of conspiracy, the court expected an execution and instead witnessed a ritual, one designed to turn authority into spectacle and memory into terror. For Ivan understood that power endured only when it scarred the imagination, and so the punishment unfolded slowly, publicly, and with deliberate cruelty. The prince stripped of rank and dignity before the eyes of men and women who knew they might be next. The act meant not to kill, but to unmake, to transform a living body into a lesson, because in Ivan's Russia, humiliation was more effective than the sword, a philosophy born from a reign that had begun with reform and hope, but curdled into suspicion after the death of his wife. Anastasia, a loss that chroniclers say shattered the Tsar's restraint and drove him to see enemies everywhere, real or imagined, and from this paranoia emerged the Oprichnina, a private realm within the state ruled by black-clad riders who answered only to Ivan and enforced his will through terror, confiscation, and ritualized punishment, their methods recorded in fragments by foreign observers and reluctant Russian scribes who described how accusations required little proof when fear itself was evidence, how the court became a theater where the Tsar mocked the condemned and demanded loyalty even as he destroyed them, and how the crowd's horror was not an accident but a tool, because every gasp, every lowered gaze carried the message outward into the streets of Moscow, where rumor did the rest of the work, ensuring obedience long after the blood was washed away. And this strategy reached beyond individuals to families and memory itself. As widows were disgraced, estates erased names removed from favor, all to demonstrate that resistance would not merely end life, but annihilate honor. And yet Ivan was not inventing something new so much as refining an ancient language of rule, one spoken in empires long before Russia's rise, where punishment was crafted as ceremony and cruelty wore the mask of law. And while later historians would debate whether Ivan was mad or methodical, the evidence suggests intention, a ruler who believed the soul must be broken publicly to keep the state intact, a belief that echoed across centuries and continents, from deserts to palaces, wherever sovereigns learned that fear, when ritualized, becomes tradition, and tradition, once sanctified, hides its violence behind obedience. A truth the Kremlin court understood that morning as they stood frozen, watching a man's life transformed into a message, unaware that this was only one chapter in a much larger history of rulers who turned punishment into performance. And as the echoes of that ritual faded through Moscow's corridors, a darker question remained unanswered. If humiliation could secure power so effectively, how many other kings had perfected the same method, and how far were they willing to go next? Grief turned into cruelty. Ivan the Terrible was not born a monster, but history shows how grief can hollow a ruler until fear becomes his only companion, because before the rituals of humiliation and blood, Ivan IV was a reformer crowned in 1547 with dreams of order, law, and a unified Russia. Yet everything changed after 1560, when his wife Anastasia Romanovna died suddenly, a loss Ivan never accepted as natural, convincing himself she had been poisoned by boyars who wished to control him. And from that moment suspicion ruled his thoughts, turning the palace into a place of shadows where every whisper sounded like treason. And it was in this psychological collapse that Ivan discovered a new language of power, one that spoke not through justice but through terror, leading him to create the Oprichnina, a private state carved from Russia, itself guarded by the Oprichniki men, dressed in black, who rode with dogs' heads and brooms tied to their saddles, symbols that they would sniff out betrayal and sweep it away. And these were not ordinary soldiers, but instruments of ritualized violence, given authority to confiscate lands, torture nobles, and carry out punishments that blurred the line between law and theater, because Ivan believed fear had to be seen to be effective, and according to accounts by foreign mercenaries like Heinrich von Staden, the Tsar did not merely order these acts, but watched them closely, sometimes mocking the condemned, sometimes questioning them mid-torture, as if loyalty could still be extracted from broken bodies, and among all punishments. Sexual mutilation held a special place, because it destroyed lineage, honor, and masculine authority at once, erasing not just the man but his future, turning nobles into warnings rather than murders. And Ivan's cruelty extended beyond the accused to their families, as widows were publicly shamed, stripped of status, and sent to convents not for salvation but erasure, ensuring that memory itself was punished. And this obsession reached its most infamous expression during the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, when Ivan accused the city of treason and unleashed weeks of ritualized terror. Executions staged in public spaces, bodies displayed, and humiliation used as a weapon against entire communities, because Ivan believed mercy bred rebellion, while fear bred silence. And yet beneath this brutality was a ruler desperately trying to control chaos, a man who thought that by mastering the body he could master fate itself. But the more he punished, the more enemies he imagined, creating a cycle where cruelty justified itself. And Russia learned that loyalty was not proven through service but through survival, a lesson burned into collective memory. While chroniclers softened their words and future generations debated madness versus strategy, unaware that Ivan was only one figure in a much older pattern, because long before Moscow trembled under his rule, other kings in distant lands had already discovered the same truth, that humiliation, when wrapped in ritual and authority, could rule longer than fear of death alone. And as Ivan's shadow stretched across Russia, another ruler in another empire was preparing his own version of punishment, disguised as morality. When law became flesh centuries before Ivan ruled from the Kremlin, Cairo lived under the gaze of another sovereign who believed that order could be carved directly into the human body. Because when al-Hakim Bayamir Allah ascended the Fatimid throne in 996, he inherited not only an empire, but the authority to define morality itself. And in his reign, law was no longer written solely in decrees or scripture, but enforced through ritual punishment meant to reshape society through fear and shame. For al-Hakim was obsessed with control, issuing commands that governed every detail of daily life, banning certain foods, restricting women's movement, and even ordering shoemakers to stop producing women as footwear so that women could not leave their homes. And those who disobeyed did not face simple fines or imprisonment, but public degradation designed to humiliate them before the city, because the caliph believed that morality had to be visible to survive. And medieval chroniclers, such as al-Makrizi, recorded how merchants accused of selling forbidden goods were stripped and mutilated in public squares, their punishment framed as purification rather than cruelty, a lesson meant to echo through the markets long after the blood dried and sexual punishment became a favored tool because it erased honor and identity at once. As men accused of immoral behavior were castrated and forced to live disguised, as women condemned not just to pain but to lifelong disgrace in a society where gender and status defined existence. And these acts were not hidden in dungeons, but staged openly. Because al-Hakim understood that crowds were essential, that fear multiplied when shared, and when whispers of conspiracy reached his court, ministers and rivals were paraded backwards through Cairo on donkeys, mocked by citizens before suffering mutilation and execution, their bodies turned into warnings that loyalty was not optional, but enforced through ritual terror. And yet al-Hakim justified these acts as divine duty, presenting himself as a ruler chosen to cleanse society, blurring the line between religion and punishment until resistance itself appeared sinful. And this fusion of sacred authority with physical humiliation made opposition nearly impossible, because to defy the caliph was to defy both law and God. And historians still debate whether al-Hakim was mad or calculated, but his policies reveal intention, a ruler who believed that shame reshaped behavior more permanently than death. And like Ivan after him, Al-Hakim extended punishment beyond individuals to memory, ensuring that disgrace lingered long after execution. And then, as suddenly as his terror had begun, Al-Hakim vanished in 1021, riding into the desert one night and never returning, leaving behind a city marked by fear and rumors that he had ascended to divinity or been murdered by his own court. But his disappearance did not erase his methods, because the lesson remained, written into Cairo's collective memory, that power could rule through humiliation as effectively as through armies. And while later dynasties softened the language of law, the practice endured in subtler forms, spreading across cultures and centuries, as rulers learned that when punishment became ritual and morality became theater, the body itself could be turned into a political weapon, a realization that would soon resurface again, not as madness or faith, but as calculated statecraft refined by kings who understood exactly what they were doing. Humiliation as a weapon of the state. By the late medieval world, rulers no longer needed to discover the power of humiliation, because it had already proven itself across empires, quietly passing from court to court like forbidden knowledge. And whether in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, kings learned the same lesson. Execution ended a threat, but ritualized degradation multiplied fear, because it transformed punishment into a shared experience, one that involved not only the victim, but the audience forced to witness it. And this is why sexual punishment, public stripping, and forced degradation became tools of governance rather than excesses of cruelty, for they attacked what societies valued most: honor, lineage, masculinity, and moral identity. And in France, England, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, accusations of treason or moral corruption were often answered with punishments meant to shame before they killed. Nobles paraded in chains, stripped of symbols of rank, sometimes subjected to mutilations meant to erase their bloodline, while crowds were summoned not as observers, but as participants whose silence signaled submission. And rulers understood that once people learned to watch without intervening, obedience followed naturally, and this logic extended even into legal systems that claimed righteousness, where humiliation was framed as correction, punishment as purification, and cruelty as necessity, allowing sovereigns to insist they were protecting order rather than enforcing terror. And across dynasties, sexual punishment carried a unique authority because it destroyed more than the individual, severing inheritance, dishonoring families, and marking entire houses as cursed, ensuring that rebellion would not be remembered as heroic, but as disgraceful. And this tactic proved especially effective against elites, because it inverted status, turning princes into objects and courtiers into witnesses of their own vulnerability. And over time, these rituals became normalized, recorded in legal codes, church decrees, and court customs, sanitized by language that disguised violence behind formality. And yet beneath this surface lay deliberate calculation. As rulers refined the timing, location, and symbolism of punishment, choosing public squares, palace halls, or religious festivals to maximize impact, and even when blood was spilled, it was done slowly, ceremonially, to allow fear to settle deeply into memory. And this practice created societies where obedience was learned visually, where children grew up hearing stories of what happened to those who defied authority, stories that blurred into legend and warning. And historians later struggled to separate fact from exaggeration precisely because terror thrives on rumor, and monarchs encouraged that ambiguity, knowing that uncertainty magnified control. And yet, despite its effectiveness, this system required silence from those who recorded history, forcing chroniclers to soften language, omit details, or frame punishment as justice, because to write the truth was itself dangerous. And so the most brutal rituals faded from official memory, surviving only in scattered manuscripts, foreign accounts, and archaeological hints, leaving modern scholars to piece together fragments of a past deliberately hidden. And as these patterns repeated across centuries, a disturbing truth emerged. Humiliation was not the symptom of tyranny. It was its strategy, refined and exported, perfected through repetition. And still, one question remained unanswered, because if these punishments were so effective, Why did later generations insist on forgetting them? And what secrets were buried when history chose silence over truth? A silence that would not last forever. The silence that followed, when the rituals of humiliation finally faded from public squares, they did not disappear because they were condemned, but because they became inconvenient to remember. As empires fell, dynasties collapsed, and new rulers sought legitimacy not through terror, but through law, faith, and progress, forcing history itself to be rewritten. And this rewriting did not erase violence so much as bury it beneath softer language, because chroniclers learned quickly that survival depended on discretion, choosing words that justified punishment as necessity while omitting the details that revealed its cruelty. And in royal archives across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, records speak of traitors disciplined, sinners corrected, order restored, yet say nothing of the stripped bodies, the mutilations, or the crowds forced to watch in silence. And this selective memory shaped how later generations understood power, allowing monarchs to be remembered as reformers or defenders of faith, while their methods were reduced to footnotes or dismissed as exaggeration. And even when witnesses tried to preserve the truth, their accounts were often marginalized, labeled as foreign gossip, heretical slander, or moral panic, because acknowledging ritual humiliation meant admitting that civilization itself had relied on calculated cruelty. And archaeology has since complicated this narrative, as mass graves, damaged remains, and palace chambers designed for public punishment contradict sanitized chronicles, forcing historians to confront evidence that bodies were used as tools of governance, and in some cases, forbidden manuscripts resurfaced, hidden in monasteries or private collections, describing punishments too shocking to publish openly in their own time, texts that reveal how law and spectacle merged into ritual. And yet, even with evidence, resistance remains, because confronting these practices threatens comforting myths about progress, suggesting that the line between barbarism and order has always been thin, and that cruelty was not the failure of systems, but their foundation. And this discomfort explains why sexual punishment, in particular, vanished from official histories, because it attacked ideals of honor, purity, and authority that later societies wanted to claim for themselves. And admitting its use would mean admitting that power was maintained not through justice, but through fear carefully staged. And so the silence endured, passed down through textbooks, monuments, and heroic portraits that celebrated rulers while ignoring their victims. And only in recent decades have scholars begun to reconstruct these hidden rituals, comparing fragmented sources, court records, and physical evidence to reveal patterns once dismissed as isolated madness. Patterns that show consistency across cultures and centuries, proving that humiliation was not accidental, but systematic. And this reconstruction has raised unsettling questions, because if history was willing to forget such practices, what else was erased, and which voices were silenced to preserve the image of authority? And as modern societies examine their own relationship with punishment, spectacle, and shame, these forgotten rituals begin to feel uncomfortably familiar, suggesting that the past is not as distant as it appears, and that the methods once used by kings did not vanish, but evolved, hidden behind new language and institutions, waiting for moments of fear to resurface. And as the last fragments of these stories emerge from archives and ruins, they force a reckoning with a truth long denied, that the machinery of humiliation was not destroyed, only concealed, and its shadow still lingers, raising a final, darker question about what humanity does when power feels threatened, a question that leads inevitably to the end of this story. The abyss beneath power, when the last fragments of these rituals are placed together, a darker picture of humanity emerges, one that cannot be blamed on a single mad king or isolated empire, because the use of humiliation as punishment was not an accident of history, but a deliberate response to fear, a strategy chosen when rulers believed their authority was fragile and obedience uncertain. And what unites Ivan in Moscow, al-Hakim in Cairo, and countless other sovereigns across time is not cruelty alone, but calculation, a shared understanding that the human body could be transformed into a language of control, spoken loudly without words, and this realization forces a troubling conclusion, that these acts were not the collapse of civilization, but part of how it was built, because terror, when ritualized, creates order more efficiently than persuasion, at least in the short term, and this truth explains why such punishments were repeated, refined and defended as necessary, moral or divine, and why they persisted until changing values made them politically dangerous rather than ethically unacceptable. And even then, they did not vanish, but were reshaped, concealed behind walls, institutions, and euphemisms, leaving behind a legacy that still influences how societies punish, shame, and exclude. And while modern states claim to have moved beyond spectacle, the instinct to humiliate remains embedded in systems that rely on public disgrace, isolation, and the destruction of identity.